Near the East Coast, the Omega Center for Educational Studies was now in its 14th year of existence and growing steadily every year. A community and campus in a forested setting, supported and enhanced by teachers, professionals, scholars, artists, intellectuals, and spiritual pilgrims from all walks of life and many nations of the world. Their binding, motivating spirit, a vision and hope for world peace and community, oneness with the rhythms of nature and the eternal expansiveness of the universe, the accepting of the impulse to change, the challenging of the unknown. It was early on a Friday morning. An angel named Cree, in appearance a Native American, sailed in over the lake behind the Omega Center and found a hiding place in an equipment shack near the beach. Then he listened. There was no sound. The timing was right. The center was deserted now. The weekday conference was over, the weekend conference was coming up, and the next group of participants was not due to arrive until that evening. Most importantly, the demon prince who normally hovered over this place was away, probably on some errand of mischief along with his demonic hordes. Cree drew his sword and waved a quick little signal with his blade. From all around, tiny points of light answered back, the tips of hundreds of angelic blades. Sally Rowe was due to arrive any moment. The angels were in place, ready to defend her. Sergeant Mulligan drove over to the post office the moment he got Lucy Brandon's call. "Hi, Lucy," he called over the counter. Lucy hurried to the back room and opened the employees-only door for him. When they were both safe from any watching eyes, she showed him a letter, still in a sealed envelope, addressed to Tom Harris. The name in the upper left corner was Sally Rowe. "When did this come in?" Mulligan asked. "Today. And look at the postmark. Just 3 days ago." Somebody's being a real sicko. It's a joke. Well, there's no address to return it to. It's kind of scary, though. The postmark is after Sally Rowe's suicide. What if Sally Rowe is still alive somewhere? So she isn't. That's crazy. But if Tom Harris ever got this letter, you never know. It might hurt your lawsuit. Lucy hesitated. What was Mulligan getting at? But what about the law? Don't worry about it. We'll cover for you. You're not going to open it. Don't worry. Just don't worry. He put the letter in his pocket and got out of there, leaving Lucy troubled, curious, nervous, and worried. Tom was reading through some notes he'd made for some upcoming interrogatories. Attorney Wayne Corrigan said the ACFA probably would skirt having to answer most of them, but he was going to ask them anyway. He had a lot of questions to ask those characters, and it was going to start right here. There was a knock on the door. He closed the folder and tucked it away on the bookshelf. Then he opened the door. The man was tall and strong-looking, about middle-aged, dressed casually. His wife was attractive, also dressed casually. "Tom Harris?" the big man asked. "Yes," he answered. Just who are you?" "The name is Marshall Hogan. This is my wife, Kate. We've come a long way, and we'd like to talk to you." Tom made a lunch of it. Tom, Pastor Howard, and Ben Cole pooled their sandwiches, chips, salad, and soft drinks, and met with the two out-of-towners in Tom's backyard for a meeting of the minds, a serious checking out of this Marshall Hogan. Sure, he was a Christian, but he also owned a newspaper, the Ashton Clarion, and by now the press was not considered friendly or trustworthy. Pastor Howard asked, "So, you weren't disillusioned by the news reports of our outrageous religious behavior?" Marshall looked every one of them in the eye as he spoke. "Well, maybe you are outrageous. Maybe you're like too many Christians who see a demon under every doily. Or maybe this whole thing is legit. If it is, then I might stick around and do what I can to help you out. I've got a young gal who can run that paper while I'm away. I'm a good snoop. I know how to dig things up. If this thing is what it looks like, then I'm ready to make myself available. And so is Kate." Could this be an answer to prayer? They decided to tell Marshall the details of the lawsuit and the strange incident with Amber Brandon that started the whole thing. Marshall listened intently. and he appeared to believe it. Did Amethyst ever show up again? Tom thought about that question. Well, not in the same way. Amber stayed quiet, but she was still really strange, depressed, edgy, inattentive. She couldn't sit still during our morning devotions, and she couldn't stand hearing the Word of God. Tom, you said something about Amber claiming to have learned all this stuff in her class at the elementary school. Right, Miss Brewer's class. All right. We'll have to talk to them and see what they know. Maybe the school board's trying out something new. In any case, it would be nice to know how Amber got the way she is and to be able to prove it. How about it, Kate? You feel like paying Miss Brewer a visit? Oh, looking forward to it. Marshall and Kate joined them in prayer, and that meant a lot to everyone. Not long after Pastor Howard said the final amen, Marshall popped the final question. So how does it sound to you? You want to deal us in, see what develops? By now, they were ready. Pastor Howard extended his hand, and he and Marshall shook on it. We have fellowship, brother. At the Omega Center, Sybil Denning, a kind and matronly educator of many years, was out for a morning stroll around the grounds when she saw a young lady coming up the main road into the complex. The angel Cree touched Mrs. Denning's eyes. Easy now, don't see too well. Then he darted into the trees and out of sight. Somewhere the other angelic warriors were present, ready and invisible. Hello, said Mrs. Denning. And who might you be? Sally smiled, but her mind was instantly far away, more than 19 years away. I know this woman. Sally found her tongue and the name she'd decided to use. I'm Bethany Farrell. I was just passing through the area, and someone told me I might find a place to stay up here. Mrs. Denning smiled. Oh, you just might. We have overnight camping here and some nice cabins. Listen, are you hungry? It's almost time for lunch, and I'm sure the cafe will have something ready. They went into the cafe and sat down to a tasty vegetarian meal. Mrs. Denning had to stare at Sally for a moment. Don't know why you seem so familiar to me. Have we ever met before? Sally would not say how. 19 years ago, Mrs. Denning taught English at Sally's high school. Nor would she help Mrs. Denning remember how this teacher had become a pivotal factor in Sally's life. As they ate lunch, Mrs. Denning enjoyed talking about her accomplishments. Years ago, several teachers acquainted with Omega took part in a program to recruit young people who showed potential for future leadership. I recruited several students myself. Sally was one of those students. She could remember the Mrs. Denning of high school telling her, it's a special summer program for exceptional students. I think you would fit the qualifications. What would I learn? Sally, the student, asked. Mrs. Denning was delighted to give such an answer. The meaning behind it all. The meaning behind it all. Now, 19 years later, Sally couldn't hold back a bitter smile. So, she asked, how have all these exceptional students turned out? Marvelous. They've gone on to become educators, psychologists, doctors, even statespersons. When we mold students in their younger years, they mature to be the future change agents in our culture. Hiding in the attic of the little cafe, Cree was hearing it all. He was getting edgy. Before long, people coming for the weekend conference would start showing up, and among them, more demons. He heard a special whistle. It was a sentry near the front gate signaling trouble. Cree shot outside and into the concealing branches of a large maple. Yeah, a van was approaching, full of weekenders, and full of demonic warriors as well, with flashing fangs and clicking razor-sharp talons. The window of opportunity was rapidly closing. They had to get Sally out of there. Say, said Sally as if she'd just remembered something, Would it be the Omega Center that published the curriculum, Finding Me? Mrs. Denning's eyes brightened. Finding the Real Me. Yes, that's a popular curriculum for grades 1 through 6. We have different programs for every grade, but the easiest implementation so far has been with the 4th graders. You know, we've had that curriculum available for about 10 years. But we only got it into the schools a few years ago. The old Christian roadblocks again. We're having great success with it now, however. The sentry whistled again, and Cree could see a 50-passenger bus full of high schoolers, several cars, another van. The first van came into the complex and pulled up in front of the registration office. From within the van, 2 demon warriors emerged and stood guard, their swords ready, their yellow eyes darting about. Then a man stepped out of the van and stretched. His face had a strange, stony expression. Cree recognized it immediately. The mysterious Mr. Steele, overseer of the Omega Center. No wonder there were such monstrous demon guards along. Both ladies had finished their lunch and now sat over cups of tea, relaxing. Sally figured the time was right for the next question. She pulled the neck chain from inside her shirt. Say, in all your travels, I was just wondering, have you ever seen a ring like this? She brought the ring out into the open and let Mrs. Denning have a good look at it. Mrs. Denning put on her reading glasses for a closer look. What is this symbol on here? I've always tried to figure that out. Well, this face could be a gargoyle, but so triangular. But you've never seen anything like it before? Oh, no, not that I know of. Mr. Steele was heading for the cafe. Cree looked across the grounds for his own forces, but they were hidden so well even he couldn't see them. Oh, no. Beyond the lake, just over the tops of the trees, a large detachment of demons was approaching like a swarm of bats. The Prince of Omega was returning. Mr. Steele went into the cafe and greeted an employee standing behind the counter. Hearing Mr. Steele's voice, Mrs. Denning turned. Oh, Mr. Steele! Sally looked down at the table immediately, trying to get the horrified expression off her face. Was her heart beating? For a moment, she thought it had stopped. Mr. Steele, I'd like you to meet a visitor we have today. This is Bethany Farrell, a traveler from Los Angeles. Mr. Steele removed his sunglasses. Sally looked up at him. Their eyes met. They knew each other. Cree drew his sword, trying to concoct a plan. With Sally cornered and demonic forces gathering, they had only minutes to spare. Cree ducked as a blazing sword slashed right over his head. Teeth, yellow eyes, gaping jaws. Cree whipped his sword in a fiery arc. The demon guard dissolved in a churning cloud of red smoke. Up ahead, Cree could see the Prince of Omega and his forces descending like a storm. Let's get Sally out of here! Mr. Steele's eyes were piercing. I'm pleased to meet you, Bethany. Mrs. Denning pulled on Mr. Steele's sleeve. Bethany has a strange ring she ought to show you. Steele leaned closer. Sally could feel the heat from his face. A ring? Sally shook her head. No, it's nothing. I'd like to see it. Bethany. Sally's head drooped. I think I'm going to be sick. She wasn't lying. Steele grabbed her wrist. Let me help you then. He lifted her from her seat. No, let me go. Mrs. Denning was startled by Mr. Steele's behavior. Mr. Steele! Steele signaled to 4 men standing outside. They started toward the cafe. Sally saw them coming and threatened, I'm going to throw up! Cree saw it happening. He banked sharply and dropped like a missile toward the cafe. Once inside, he careened over the tables and along the counter, sword extended. An entire row of drinking glasses shattered. Mr. Steele's hand went to his eyes. Sally ran for the door. The 4 men didn't see her, and neither did the demon spirits attached to them. The angels had managed to blind them just long enough for Sally to escape. But the evil Prince of Omega and his hordes were now descending on the campus, flushing out a blizzard of brilliant warriors who scattered in all directions like frightened birds. The demons shrieked and gave chase. This was the kind of sport they were hoping for. Retreat! 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 The angels fled, leading the demonic hordes further into the sky, further from the campus, further from the trouble below. Cree and Cy kept close to Sally, trying to force her under trees and out of sight. Good. Run, girl. Just run! Back in Bacon's Corner, strife and division continued to spread among the saints. Some of the families, no longer trusting Tom Harris or Pastor Howard, removed their children from the school and themselves from the church. Tal, the captain of the host, could see it all happening, but thus far he was powerless to stop it, and the prayers of the saints kept ebbing away. But Sally Rowe continued her journey, retracing her old paths and writing letters to Tom Harris to tell him everything she remembered about the Omega Center and the early training she received there in mysticism and occultism. Soon, she hoped, the puzzle would be complete. Marshall Hogan, Tom Harris, and Ben Cole were putting together a puzzle, too. Tom's kids had said that Irene Bledsoe almost got into a wreck with the driver of a blue pickup truck. Well, Sally Rowe drove a blue pickup truck. Could she have been the driver Irene Bledsoe almost hit? They had to find out for sure. In the meantime, Kate Hogan was learning more about the Finding the Real Me curriculum by visiting Miss Brewer's fourth grade class at Bacon's Corner Elementary. As Kate sat in the back of the classroom jotting down notes, Miss Brewer took the children through an exercise spelled out in the curriculum. She had the children lie on the floor, breathe deeply, relax, 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 and then start to visualize inner guides, wise persons, entities who would come and give them wisdom and advice. After the exercise, the children returned to their seats and began to draw pictures of the friends they'd encountered on their inner journeys. As Kate strolled up and down the rows of desks, she saw pictures of ponies, dragons, princes and princesses, and some rather frightening monsters as well. Kate finally asked Miss Brewer, so tell me, wasn't Amber Brandon in your class this year? Miss Brewer had nothing to hide. Oh, yes, she was in my class, and I understand she'll be back once again to finish out the year. Then can you tell me about Amethyst, the pony? Miss Brewer rose from her desk and pointed out a crayon picture posted high above the chalkboard. Here she is, right here. It was an eerie experience. So this was Amethyst. A little purple pony with shining pink mane and tail. A beautiful drawing for a 10-year-old. Kate swallowed. Her mouth went suddenly dry. And you hold that this image is Miss Brewer answered, a visualization of Amber's own inner wisdom. Or maybe something else, Kate thought. Not long after Sally escaped from the Omega Center, Mr. Steele and his associates received a welcome clue to Sally's purposes and whereabouts. The first letter she'd sent to Tom Harris, intercepted by Sergeant Mulligan and sent to the Omega Center instead. So Sally was telling her story to Tom Harris in letters. They decided they would have Lucy Brandon keep intercepting the letters. Sooner or later, Sally would reveal her plans and whereabouts, and they would be able to capture her. Now Sally was in the town of Fairwood, only half an hour from the Omega Center. Up ahead, on her side of the street, was a large rectangular sign, Schrader Motor Inn. The motel was still there. She looked up at the third story. She could see room 302 down near the end. It had been her home for almost 10 months. Hello, said the lady behind the counter. Can I help you? Yes, I was wondering if you had a kitchen unit available. Room 302, by any chance? The lady slid the application across the counter to her, and Sally filled it out. She reached the third floor and placed her hand on the balcony railing. Out of her buried memory came the image of squad cars parked in the lot below, their lights flashing, the other tenants watching through their windows, peeking around the drapes, curious and anonymous. She could feel the pain of hands holding her arms, pushing her along this balcony. There was an aid car down there, too, and some medical personnel running around. She could just barely remember them. Ben Cole had just received a police report from a friend in another precinct. "Marshal, that picture isn't of the dead woman we found out at Potter's Farm, but it is Sally Rowe." Marshal picked up the police photo and studied it carefully. The tired, gaunt, and dazed woman in the photographs looked every bit the part of a half-drunk or half-drugged tramp. Mugshots never were very complimentary, but even so. Ben went on to explain, according to the National Crime Information Center and the State Information Section, Sally Rowe was arrested once, 10 years ago. Marshall studied the photo and the file. He was bothered about something. Fairwood, Massachusetts. Ben pointed out a short police bulletin. "It's bizarre. Nothing like I expected." Marshall read the bulletin as his face filled with horror and disbelief. First-degree murder. The elderly Alice Buckmeyer of Bacon's Corner was a marvelous hostess and loved to have company. So what Kate had planned as a short interview turned out to be a delightful visit over tea and pastries. Alice had witnessed something she thought Kate and the others should know about.
I was running an errand at the post office. I was standing at the counter when all of a sudden I heard this commotion. The little girl, Amber, was screaming and shouting and prancing like she was a little horse, terrifying this poor woman. Then she hit the woman and said, "I know who you are. You killed your baby. You killed your baby."
The fax machine started to hum and roll out some documents. A contact in New York had done some research and was sending the results. Police reports and news clippings on the Rowe infant murder case. Marshall picked each page up as it dropped into the bin. Sally Rowe had been arrested after police broke down the door of her motel room in Fairwood, Massachusetts. They had found Rowe in the bathroom in a seemingly drugged stupor, and her infant daughter, less than 2 months old, drowned in the bathtub. Rowe was subsequently charged with first-degree murder in the drowning death of her child. Marshall walked slowly to his car, got behind the wheel, and then just sat there, reading. It was fascinating stuff, but also very tragic. Sally Rowe was soaking wet when she was found on the floor in the bathroom. The tub was overflowing. The child was in the tub, dead. She'd told the police at the time that she'd killed her baby, but when questioned later, claimed she had no recollection of what happened. During the trial, and Marshall found this interesting, Sally seemed detached and unremorseful. "It was meant to be," she said. "Rachel's higher self wished to die at this time, and Jonas was there to carry it out. There is no death. There is only change." Jonas. A spirit guide, according to Sally. She admitted drowning the child at first, but later seemed to change her testimony, blaming her spirit guide. "He took control," she said, "and he did the drowning." The jury didn't buy it. They found her guilty, and Sally was later sentenced to 30 years in prison. As for the father of the child, he never came forward and was never found. Sally never identified him. It all happened 10 years ago. The faucet seemed to mark off segments of time, like a clock, never stopping, never slowing, steady dripping, moments passing. Sally sat there, staring vacantly at that tub, listening to the faucet drip, watching every drop build on the tip of the spout, and then, stretching with weight, break free and disappear. drip, drip, drip. Miss Rowe, did you think there was no law higher than yourself?
There is no higher reality, sir, than what I myself have created.
You honestly don't recall picking up your child, holding her under the water, and drowning her?
I told you before, I wasn't there. It was Jonas.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard an account of the unthinkable. This vile creature, void of conscience, without remorse. Sally shifted just a little. The hard linoleum floor reminded her of where she was. A small, cold, echoing bathroom with a dripping bathtub faucet, inhabited by a murderer, a failure, an empty jar drained steadily over 10 years of pointless, aimless existence. Spirits had found her. Despair, death, insanity, and now suicide. They dug at her, whispered to her, scratched away her soul one layer at a time. Sally's hand fell from her lap and thumped gently against the side of the tub.
A fence. This tub could be a fence, a boundary I crossed over and shouldn't have. Even if I'm on the wrong side of it, I need a fence. I need to be wrong. I need to be guilty.
Why? She mouthed the words, then she said them out loud. Because at least then I'd know where I am. Apparently, she'd awakened a dormant emotion. Pain came upon her suddenly, an aching deep in her soul. She rested against the hard plaster wall again, panting in hurt, anger, and despair. Oh, God, help me.
Despair slipped and fell.
His talons had lost their grip. For some reason, she felt a weight around her neck against her chest. Her hand went to the ring hanging there. She pulled it out and looked at it again. The ugly little gargoyle bared its teeth at her. And then a memory hit her. The ring. Owen's ring. When Tom was able to visit his kids again, attorney Wayne Corrigan went with him. Tom could see Irene Bledsoe eyeing everything he brought for the kids, but he proceeded slowly and openly, having nothing to hide. Well, almost nothing. Josiah was thumbing through his new book about whales when he found some photos inserted between the pages. Tom and Corrigan tried not to look at him too directly, lest they draw Bledsoe's attention.
"Hey," said Josiah, "the lady in the pickup truck."
That got Bledsoe's attention immediately. She saw Josiah holding the pictures, studying them with wide-eyed recognition. Her face went visibly pale. Corrigan asked, "What do you mean, son? Have you seen that woman before?" Bledsoe jumped to her feet.
"Mr. Harris!"
Corrigan pressed Josiah for an answer. "Do you recognize her?"
"Sure," said Josiah. "She's the lady that was driving that truck we almost hit. She always looks kind of sick, doesn't she?"
Sally went out in search of an old red brick building not far from the motel. She remembered there was a cobblestoned alley with a stream of water running down its center and a grate over a drain, but where was it? Tal followed right behind her. Nathan and Armot hovered just above, swords drawn. "Keep going, Sally," said Tal. "You're getting warmer." Sally turned down a side street. These potted elms looked familiar, though they were much bigger now. This had to be it. The same narrow cobblestoned alley, the same towering red brick walls of the old brewery. It was somewhere along here, a loose brick in a windowsill. She was remembering more and more as she ran along, looking carefully at each window, hoping for any detail that would trigger a memory. Tal could see the angelic sentries ahead, guarding the spot. At the sight of Sally Rowe approaching, they raised their swords and let out a cautious, muffled cheer. Sally approached the rear corner of the building. There was one last window, and the brick sill was at eye level. She touched the sill, ran her fingers along it. She put her thumb under the brick on the left end and gently pressed upward. For the first time in 10 years, it budged. The light of day flooded the cavity underneath it. Sally's heart leaped. She could see a faint glint of gold. She lifted the brick further. There lay the ring. She reached into the niche and pulled it out into the light. Yes, it was the same as the other ring. Now there were 2 little gargoyles, snarling at her with identical expressions. 10 years later, this ring could be a key to reopen the past, to view it all again, to find out what went wrong. She thought of Tom Harris and those Christians at the little school in Bacon's Corner. Have I done wrong? If so, then let me do something right, just this once. She unclasped the chain around her neck and placed the second ring beside the first. Praise God, said Tom, so excited he couldn't sit still. I can't believe it. Progress! Tom, Marshall, Kate, and Ben were having another powwow with Wayne Corrigan in his office, not too long after that rather explosive meeting with Irene Bledsoe. Ben had gotten over his excitement. Now he was pensive, probing. Sally Rowe is alive, and Mulligan knows it. Kate wondered, but what are they trying to hide, and why? I talked to the elementary school principal, and he assures me he'll find the Finding the Real Me curriculum so I can look at it. But if you ask me, he's stalling. I think that curriculum has a major role in all of this. Well, said Marshall, it serves the agenda of the Omega Center and our plucky Miss Brewer, the school board, and who knows who else. These people are just as evangelical about their religion as we are, and they're wasting no time. Take a mother involved with this cosmic mystic group. Lucy Brandon, said Tom. Add the cosmic mystic group controlling the school board and pumping cosmic mystic curricula into the local school. Then get a well-meaning, crusading teacher. Miss Brewer, volunteered Kate. And what do you get? A little girl channeling an evil spirit. So what does Sally Rowe have to do with it? Asked Tom. The location of the Omega Center that published that curriculum. That was in Fairwood, Massachusetts, right? Ben, where did you get that arrest record, the one that included the mugshots of Sally Rowe? Ben was stunned as he double-checked the document. Fairwood, Massachusetts. So, a lady gets arrested for murder clear across the country, but then shows up in this little place for no apparent reason. In the meantime, a curriculum is published in the same town where she was arrested and finds its way here. A little girl ends up demonized, most likely because of that curriculum, and later confronts Rowe in the post office and says, I know you killed your baby. Marshall smiled and shook his head at his own conclusions. That demon was in Fairwood. It knew about Sally Rowe. And then, said Ben. Marshall verified his thought. And then somebody comes along and tries to kill Sally Rowe. The very same day my kids were taken, said Tom. And the very day before you got your summons. Marshall looked over all the notes one more time and answered, We can theorize that Sally Rowe's so-called suicide has something to do with the lawsuit against the school, but there just isn't any visible connection. Yet. Sally felt no anxiety, no fear. If she felt anything, it was a new kind of exhilaration. She still couldn't believe the incredible recovery of that second ring. She considered herself extremely lucky or fortunate. She wasn't ready to say blessed. She rounded the corner, passed under the breezeway of the motel, and started up the stairs to room 302. She'd just reached the first landing and was starting up the second flight of stairs when she didn't feel right about something. Oh, Mrs. Bissell. It was the office lady. Sally was relieved to hear her voice. Yes, I'm up here. Could I see you for a minute? A man on the flight below hurried back down and ran across the parking lot. Sally saw him ducking around the corner. In the motel office, the lady clerk spoke in a hush. "There's a man up in your room waiting for you. He said he was your husband." Sally backed toward the door. I don't have a husband. I don't know who you are or who he is, but I ran a check and there's no such thing as a 79 Mustang with the license number you gave, and no such thing as a Buick Regal with the license number he gave. Sally didn't know what to say. I'm sorry. I got your bag out of the room when I let him in. Is there some kind of trouble? I don't want anything weird going on in my motel. Sally took the bag. Thank you. Should I call the police? No. I'll just leave. Keep the rent money. It's okay. What about what's his name upstairs? Sally was backing toward the door. She looked out the window to make sure he wasn't lurking about. Yes, call the police. And then she fled. Bentmore University was nestled within the tight red brick grid of a major metropolis. To the human eye, Bentmore seemed an oasis of peace, reflection, and learning amid the hubbub of its surroundings. In the spiritual realm, the real trouble was within its borders, not outside them. Sally found a comfortable desk hidden away in the stacks of the research library. She checked her watch. It was after 9. Someone should be in Professor Lynch's office by now. This would be the greatest risk of all, but she must contact him. Of all people, he should have some of the answers she needed. All she could hope was that the man was not as brilliant as she remembered him to be. Perhaps he wouldn't recall who she was. Wayne Corrigan and Gordon Jefferson, the ACFA attorney, were never going to be good friends. That was readily apparent. "Mr. Jefferson, I'm simply saying that we have the right to confront our accuser." Corrigan was feeling very forceful, but Jefferson came back just as firm. "Your accuser, Mr. Corrigan, is Lucy Brandon, not Amber. And you have already deposed Mrs. Brandon in such a harsh manner as to cause her terrible distress. We wouldn't think of putting Amber in the same situation." "We do not wish to cause Amber any grief. We'll work within restrictions. We'll be gentle. But so far, everything we've heard, all the testimony, all the grievances have come through either Lucy Brandon or your psychologist." "Amber is not going to testify or be forced to go through a deposition. We will fight that, sir." "Then we want our psychologist to examine her. At least then we'd have our own expert testimony to balance the testimony of yours." "Absolutely not. Amber is not to be involved in this case in any way. She must be kept separate from it. She must be protected from any further abuse and intimidation." Corrigan looked across his desk at Marshall, who was closely listening and watching Corrigan's side of the conversation. "I'm afraid we can't back down in this matter," Corrigan told Jefferson. "If you won't change your mind, then we'll ask the court to compel her availability and testimony." "We're prepared for that." "Very well, then." Corrigan hung up. If we could just get her on that stand, just get Amethyst to manifest once, we could build an argument that Tom's behavior in confronting Amethyst was justified. Wouldn't it be great if we could get Amethyst to tear up the courtroom? We could win this case. Sally got an appointment with Professor Lynch and made it to his office on time at 6 in the evening. It was an odd hour, but he was usually in his office at this time anyway and would be happy to see her. Sally pushed through the doors. April Freeman to see Professor Lynch?" The lady smiled and nodded. "Yes, the woman from the register. That's me." She picked up her telephone and pressed a button. "The lady from the register is here to see you." She looked at Sally. "He'll be right with you. Go ahead and have a seat." Sally stood near the couch in the waiting area, but did not sit in it. She was too uncomfortable to sit and apt to run. She tried to take some deep breaths to steady herself. "Miss Freeman!" Sally turned. There stood Professor Samuel W. Lynch. She forced a smile and extended her hand. "Hello." "A pleasure. Come this way." The professor led Sally into his office and offered her a comfortable chair. The room was dead silent, like a crypt. Lynch took a seat behind his desk and relaxed for a moment, studying her face. Sally looked back at him and tried to smile. "So you're with the Register?" Professor Lynch asked, leaning back in his chair.
Yes, I just started this quarter.
"And what is your major?"
Economics.
He smiled. "Good enough. What do you think of Professor Parker?"
Uh-oh. Was this a test? Who was Professor Parker? Was it a he or a she? Was Parker even alive? Sally fumbled. I still get the profs mixed up. I just transferred in.
He laughed. "Well, no matter. You'll get to know them, and I'm sure they'll get to know you. Where are you from, anyway?" Sally was using a phony accent.
Knoxville, Tennessee.
Sally opened her notebook.
I just wanted to ask you some questions.
She'd written several down, but now...
I'm just trying to find my questions. I had them here somewhere. I'm still a bit new at this.
She found the questions.
I thought it would be interesting to track down a Bentmore success story and do an article about Owen Bennett.
He smiled. Owen Bennett, a fascinating man. But say, would you excuse me for just a moment?
Oh, certainly.
He rose from his chair and hurried from the room, leaving her alone. Sally had trouble breathing, as if her chest were collapsing. Her palms were leaving wet patches on the arms of the chair. Her skin was crawling. She had to get out of here. This room was alive with evil about to crush her. She saw it. A cry escaped from her throat. Just behind the desk, directly opposite from where she sat, a row of angry, golden eyes glared at her from the bookshelf. But no, they were not eyes. They were 4 golden symbols on the spines of 4 ornately bound volumes. They were faces, ghastly, triangular faces, all seemingly snarling at her. Little gargoyles. Sally's mouth dropped open, and she stared, transfixed. With fingers numbed and fumbling, she pulled at the chain around her neck. The 2 rings emerged from hiding, and she held them side by side in front of her face, looking at them, and then beyond them at the faces on the 4 volumes. Identical. When Lynch returned to his office, he found his guest looking quite wilted and noticeably white. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked.
She smiled weakly. To be honest, I think I'm battling a little bit of flu or something.
"Oh, I'm very sorry. Well, let's try to proceed with this interview as quickly as possible then." Sally got out her pen and prepared to take some notes. Lynch started talking without any questions. "As you must know, Owen Bennett was a law professor here for several years. He was adventuresome, innovative, intelligent." This moving tribute to Owen Bennett continued for several minutes. Sally wrote it all down as best she could, hoping desperately to find some point where she could just cut it off and get out of there. Professor Lynch had been sitting in his chair, turned slightly away from Sally, now with hardly any pause at all, but with a strange, ominous change in his tone. He swiveled his chair toward her. "Owen served on the advisory board for a new visionary effort, the Omega Center for Educational Studies, located in Fairwood, Massachusetts." Sally wrote it down. She noticed that Lynch stopped to watch her. "The Omega Center, you'll understand, is a center for the facilitation of change in our society, beginning with its most vulnerable and moldable segment, its children. But of course, you know all that." His eyes narrowed, and a grin, it looked malicious, slowly spread on his face. "As an example, I can recall an extremely bright young lady who spent several summers at the Omega Center before starting her studies here at Bentmore. After she earned her master's degree in education here, wouldn't you know it, she desired to return to the Omega Center and be a part of that dream." Sally jotted down some notes. She was finished. Very finished. "Fortunately, she and Owen Bennett were the closest of friends, and by that time he was on the Omega Advisory Board, so her position with the Omega Center was an instant reality. Sally had heard enough. She had to get out of there. Oh, just one more thing, Professor Lynch insisted, gesturing for Sally to remain seated. I know of a skilled, upcoming young attorney who allowed a lady friend of questionable background to know him just a little too well, and she later attempted to use that knowledge as a lever against him. Lynch suddenly reached into his pocket and brought out a small jewelry box. This is why I stepped out of the office momentarily. I knew you'd be interested in this. Lynch flipped it open and showed her the contents. It was a gold ring, the same gargoyle. Professor Lynch's voice grew quiet and somber. This young lawyer hired his lady friend to kill someone, and he paid her a large sum of money to do it. But she stole a very personal item of his sacred ring, knowing that forever afterward, she would be able to prove that she had had an alliance with him. She wore the ring on her person when she tried to carry out the grisly deed, and we have good reason to believe she carried the money on her person as well, so that, should something go wrong, she would be found with it and a connection could be made to the one who hired her. At any rate, the ring was identical to this one, and with the money was a perfect lever to blackmail and manipulate him. He let Sally view it for just a moment, and then abandoned all cordiality when he demanded, "You do have James Bardine's ring in your possession, don't you?" Sally rose to her feet, but wobbled there, feeling faint, lightheaded with terror. Words wouldn't come. Thank you, sir, she said, nausea washing over her. I need to go now. She hurried to the door and threw it open. A huge man filled the doorway, blocking her escape. This is Mr. Cole, a highly motivated individual now in our employ. Why don't you have a seat again so we can complete this interview, Sally Beth Rowe? What did you do with the ring you took from your attacker's finger? Sally couldn't think of a good enough lie, so she said nothing. Of course. You're not going to tell me. Just as your would-be murderess, you took it for insurance. But really, why do you want to help that pitiful little teacher in Bacon's Corner? Sally looked at him, then at the sinister Cull, and then back at Lynch again. Are you going to kill me? Lynch smiled. You have two options, Sally. Find a deep, deep hole somewhere and disappear into it. Or consider your life ended altogether. Perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow, but most certainly. He nodded to Cole, who stepped away from the door. Sally went through the door and then she ran, tears blurring her eyes. Mr. Cole took a moment to relax in the same chair where Sally had sat. Professor Lynch asked him, how many men do you have tailing her? 5 around the building, 5 more on the main campus walks. Good. After today, we'll have that ring, and the saga of Sally Rowe will be over. Lynch leaned back in his chair. Oh, such a nasty business. But I suppose you Satanists take it all in stride. You know, we're all killers at heart, Professor Lynch. Well, just do it quickly and spare me the details. It's too bad you let her go. Don't be silly. I don't want it happening anywhere near here. Cole was looking toward the bookshelves behind Lynch. Well, what I'm saying is, I think she ripped you off. Didn't you have your rosters there on that shelf? Cole was right. The 4 volumes that bore the strange symbol of the snarling gargoyle were gone, leaving a distressing gap. The demon destroyer could see a tiny, frightened figure bursting out of Whitcomb Hall. So how strong are you now, Captain Tal? We will make you show us, he called to his fellow demons. Take her! Sally ran from Whitcomb Hall toward the bus stop, but then she saw some of Cull's killers there waiting for her. She turned and ran as they chased her through the gardens and alleyways. Beneath their dark leather coats, they carried the shining silver tools of ritual death. One of them put a portable radio to his jaw and muttered, "She's..." He was about to say which direction she was going, but suddenly she was gone. Cree and Cy stood directly in front of the men, wings outstretched. Behind them, Sally continued to run south, dashing down some steps, dropping out of sight. "The woman!" screamed the destroyer from the sky. "Get the woman!" Sally took only a few seconds to duck into some shrubs and retrieve her hidden duffel bag. She jammed her carry bag into it and continued running past the Physical Sciences building, over a plaza, and then down a long flight of concrete stairs to the busy streets below. A taxi was approaching. She waved furiously. "Taxi! Taxi!" The taxi drove by, not slowing. Two more of Cull's men spotted her. Sally bolted into an alley. It was a blind alley, sheer concrete walls and no escape. The men closed in behind her, silent, skillful. If they moved quickly enough, they could finish her before she had a chance to scream. One had a long scarf in his hands, the other held a gleaming knife. Filthy spirits were there, too, whooping and frothing, bouncing off the walls like golf balls down a gutter. Sally backed away until she came up against the sheer, featureless concrete at the end of the alley. So much for flight, now for fight. She raised her duffel bag to shield herself. The scarf hit her face. Her head hit the wall. One eye was covered. She couldn't see. A knife flashed. The knife deflected and lodged in the duffel bag. He pulled the blade free and plunged it at her again. The knife ripped through her coat. Her scream was muffled inside the scarf. The knife man grabbed her coat sleeve. An angel dropped out of the sky, tracing an exclamation point of light. His sword caught the seam at Sally's shoulder, and the sleeve tore away. She ran, alive. Heavenly warriors, Kaiman, Skion, and Signa were cut, bruised, and limping from the battle with Sally's demonic enemies, but they grabbed hold of Sally and got her out of that alley. Marv and Claudia Simpson just happened to be driving by when Claudia saw a woman running out of the alley. "Oh my," said Claudia. "What's going on here? Let's pick her up." He pulled over. "You need a ride?" Sally pulled the door open and clambered into the back seat. "Please, get me away from here." Four men appeared on the sidewalk, two with radios. They saw her get into the car and quickly disappeared. Asked Marv, "where are you headed?" Sally was gasping for breath, sick with terror. "I don't care. Anywhere away from here." Claudia looked over her shoulder at the pitiful creature slumped over in the back seat. "You poor dear." Marv looked at her through the rear-view mirror and could see the fear in her eyes. The Lord spoke to his heart. Yeah, it was no accident that he'd picked her up. "Well, you just take it easy and try to rest. We'll get you far away from here. I know just the place." The midday business in the town of Ashton was in full swing. Driving past it all, Marv and Claudia Simpson introduced Sally Beth Rowe, they thought her name was Betty Smith, to their town. "That's the Ashton Clarion," said Marv. "It comes out on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the editor's a saint. I think he's been out of town for a while. I don't know what he's been doing." Marv turned left and came to a row of large, turn-of-the-century homes. He pulled over and parked in front of the most inviting house of all, with a perfectly manicured lawn, pillared front porch, and an inviting porch swing. In front, just beside the walkway, was a small, unpretentious sign. Sarah Barker's boarding house. "Here's the place I told you about," said Marv. "It'll be just right, I think," said Claudia. "You'll have time to think things through and get your head clear." Sally took their hands and held them tightly. "You've done me a wonderful kindness. Thank you very much. Sarah's a good gal. You'll like her." Sarah was, and Sally did. "Now, we have a downstairs bathroom, but it's being worked on. When we get the plumbing fixed, things should be back to normal." Sally looked into the bathroom. It was large, and during normal times, it was probably very nice. A young man in coveralls on his knees was reinstalling the toilet and noticed Sally watching him. Oh, hi there." Sarah leaned in. "Hank, this is Betty Smith, a new boarder. Betty, this is Hank Bush, our pastor." Sally was fascinated. This was a pastor?
I suppose you know God?
Sure, I know him. He was so matter-of-fact about it. Sally tried a tougher question.
Can you prove he exists?
Hank sat back from the toilet and just looked at her for a moment. Got a Bible? Sally was about to say no, but Sarah said,
There's one up in her room.
Hank was thinking. Tell you what, read Psalm 119 and just ask God to speak to your heart while you read it. See what happens.
Psalm 119, Sally repeated.
Right.
Good luck with the toilet.
Thanks, and nice to meet you. Hank prayed right there.
Lord God, please make yourself real to Betty Smith. Show her how much you love her.
It was quiet at Floyd and Sarah Barker's after dinner. Sally was snuggled in the soft bed under one of Sarah's handmade comforters, her back supported by an ample supply of large pillows. For the first time in so many years, Sally held in her hands a volume she had blamed for the world's woes, belittled as an overrated anthology of myths, resented for its narrow views of morality, condemned as oppressive and authoritarian, and ignored as an outmoded, stagnating lead weight around the intellectual ankle of mankind. It was one of Sarah Barker's Bibles. She found the book of Psalms immediately. Psalm 119. Blessed are they whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. That first verse was enough to grab her attention, and she read on. The words spoke to her about something she'd fled from for years, denied, fought against, and finally lost, but perhaps needed most of all. Absolutes. A genuine right and a genuine wrong. A fence, a point of reference, a way to know something for sure. Very early on Sunday morning, Ben Cole stood in the gate to Sally Rowe's goat pen, incredulous, sickened, wary of proceeding inside. This couldn't be real. Things like this just didn't happen, not around here. Ben approached a goat's dead and butchered carcass. The blood had been drained. The legs were gone. No clues, no footprints. Well, maybe I should, Sally thought. It's one thing I haven't tried yet. It might clarify some of the old memories I haven't been able to fully recall. It would be an interesting glimpse into middle-class American religious culture. Perhaps it might... Get your coat then, said Sarah Barker. Floyd's warming up the car right now. And that's how she found herself standing in front of the little white Ashton Community Church, a half-mile up Morgan Hill on Poplar Street, on a warm and beautiful Sunday morning. Sarah spared no pains to make sure Sally met everyone, and Sally smiled and shook the hands extended to her. She followed Floyd and Sarah to a place in a wooden pew near the back and sat down. Her feet could touch the floor. The last time she sat in a pew, 30 years ago, her feet dangled. She tried to relax and looked around the small sanctuary at the backs of all those heads. There was the pastor, Hank, what's-his-name, closing off a conversation and taking a chair on the platform. Now he looked a little more like a pastor with a suit and tie, but she knew she'd never forget that guy wrestling with a toilet back at the boarding house. But what am I doing here, really, she wondered. Is it just because Sarah invited me? No, not really. The invitation was as good an incentive as any, but not the real reason. Sally wanted to be here, even though it was only now that she realized it. Sally, Sarah, and Floyd all scooted over a little to make room for a young lady to sit next to Sally. Hi, she said, offering her hand. I'm Bernice Kruger.
Sarah piped up. Bernice works for our local newspaper.
Betty Smith. Sally had to be sure she remembered the right name.
She's our new boarder,
said Sarah. After church, Sally accepted Bernice Kruger's invitation to lunch, and they talked about God, his love for mankind, his absolutes, man's rebellion, God's forgiveness.
I don't feel forgiven,
Sally had to comment. Bernice asked, have you ever asked God to forgive you?
But how can I know he's even there?
Bernice seemed to know Sally's heart. She replied simply, you know.
Well, I hope you'll indulge the question.
Sure.
Did Jesus die for me?
Bernice looked Sally in the eye and gave her a firm, even reply. Yes, he died for you, Betty Smith, just like he died for Bernice Kruger.